Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 36, The History of Chad. So today's drink of choice is jus de fruit. It's like the karkanji we talked about in the Central African Republic episode. It's a drink that is apparently commonly sold on street corners in the country. It's essentially like a fruit smoothie, I guess, so it's milk, sugar, some spices, and then some sort of fruit, hence the name, jus de fruit. It seems really open-ended with what kind of fruit you want to use. I use pineapple just because the recipe I found called for pineapple, but guava, mango, orange, and papayas all seem to be common ingredients. Personally, I found the mixing of pineapple and milk together to just be a really strange combination. I think part of it was I didn't blend it fully together enough, so that might have messed up the intended texture, and with more spices it could have been improved. But still, it was just kinda weird. I don't think I'd make it again. If you want to drink from the region, I just recommend karkanji. So Chad is located in Central Africa. It has the Central African Republic to the south, Sudan to the east, Libya to the north, and Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon to the west. It also has Lake Chad, the lake the country gets its name from, located in the southwest, although, as we will talk about, it might not border the lake for much longer. Chad is like many African countries we have talked about, the CAR, Burkina Faso, Benin, and Cameroon, divided between a north that is desert-like and a south that is more wet and forest-like. Chad's desert-like areas are just that, a desert, with the northern half of the country in the Sahara Desert. The southern half is much more wet, especially around Lake Chad and around the Lagone region. Chad's desert-like climate in the north means much of the country's almost 18 million people are in the south. The country is divided between roughly 200 ethnic groups, with no single group making up even a third of the country's population. Every website I found has different numbers, but most websites generally put 3 ethnic groups as the most populous. First, there is the Sahara, who are found in the south along the border with the CAR, and make up between 15 to 30% of the population. Then there are the Bajara Arabs, who seem to be a mix of Arabs who moved into the country, along with local African peoples who integrated into their society, found primarily in the middle of the country, and make up between 8 to 13% of the country. Then there is the Kenembu, who are located around Lake Chad, and make up between 5 to 9% of the population. Other notable groups are the Sakawa, found along Chad's border with the Darfur region of Sudan, the Fula, a large ethnic group found throughout the southern Sahara and the Sahel, and the Tubu, found in the north. Language-wise, most people are multilingual. Due to the ethnically diverse nature of the country, Arabic is used as a lingua franca in many parts of the country and is one of the official languages of the country. Arabic in Chad is apparently unique due to it borrowing words and grammar from neighboring African languages. The other official language is French, which is likely used in politics, education, or professional environments, like in other ex-French colonies in the region. Finally, Chad religiously is divided between a Muslim north and a Christian south. Around 55% of the country is Muslim, and although Sunni Muslim is the most numerous Islamic denomination, there is a large amount of variety among Chadian Muslims, with some Muslims being very strict, others mixing Islam with traditional African religions, others having a much more laid-back view of religion, and others belonging to Shia sects. Christianity is also divided between Catholics and Protestants, with both groups making up around roughly 20% of the population, and similar to Muslims, some being very strict in their religion, others being laid back, and others having a more syncretic view. Finally, the rest of the country is a combination of Baha'is, traditional animalists, or those who hold no real religious beliefs. Chad's north long ago was believed to be much wetter, and possibly contained several settlements throughout it. The northern Tibetsi mountains have had several sites with rock art, showing ancient humans and African wildlife like giraffes and cattle interacting in a region that is now inhospitable desert. However, around 3000 BCE, Africa began heating up and desertification expanded to where it is today, with much of the northern half of the country only settled by nomadic peoples. Now, traveling in a desert is very difficult, with the whole extremely hot and no water thing. But the domestication of the camel, which can thrive in desert climates, would make it a lot easier to travel. Starting in the 700 CE, large caravans began moving across the Sahara. Arabs brought with them fabrics, horses, salt, and sugar, while they, in exchange, received coconuts, gold, ivory, cotton, and slaves. Over the course of several centuries, some 10 million people were believed to have been sold as slaves across the Sahara. This trade network began to allow several kingdoms to be established in the Sahel region across West Africa. In Chad, this would lead to the establishment of Kenem. Kingdom would be founded in the city of Njemi around the shores of Lake Chad. They would prove to be highly successful at raiding their southern neighbors, using their horses and iron weapons to effectively raid the southern tribes. While at first it would be an animalist kingdom, after the Kenembu people took over the kingdom in the 1080s, it switched to an Islamist state, with its elites converting and setting up mosques and madrasas in the region. At the height of the state, it controlled much of what is now Chad, along with parts of Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. However, in the 1300s, with invasions and wars from several other groups in the region, Kennem's political elites moved into northeast Nigeria, setting up the Bornu Empire, which would last until almost the 20th century. However, other Sahel kingdoms would be established in Chad. South of Kennem, the Sultanate of Bagirmi would be set up, gaining more influence as the 17th century progressed. To the east, the Awadi Sultanate would be set up, forming as a breakoff of the neighboring Darfur Sultanate. Both of these states would, similar to Kennem, raid for slaves in the south, made extensive use of cavalry in their armies, would Islamify their kingdoms, and would fight with neighboring rival states. By the 1850s, these Sahel states began to enter a decline as the trans-Saharan slave trade died out. While these states traded in more than just slaves were their primary export, and so these kingdoms started to decline in power. By the 1890s and 1900s, they increasingly became challenged by the French, who set up outposts in the region, including at Fort Lamy on the Lagone River, and were in control of much of the south of the country. France would colonize most of Chad after two major military campaigns in the early 20th century. First, they would fight off Rabi Azubair, a warlord who established his own state around Lake Chad and conquered the Bornu Empire. He would come into conflict with the French, who were allied with the Bagarmi, who feared Rabi would take power from them, and the French defeated and killed Rabi at the Battle of Khorisari. This helped solidify French holdings north and east of Lake Chad. Finally, they would take eastern Chad after defeating the Uwadi in the Uwadi War. While the French did suffer several setbacks in the war, they took the Uwadi capital in 1909, and by 1912 had effectively won the war and taken all of what is now Chad. While other violent insurgencies and rebellions would break out, France would officially control all of what is now Chad and could begin their civilizing mission. However, similar to what I talked about with the Central African Republic, Chad would prove difficult to civilize. Chad, like the Central African Republic, was viewed as a backwater of the French Empire, poor and lacking in valuable resources. This made the French far less interested in Chad than its other colonies, so while France usually attempted to assimilate and enlighten their colonial subjects, in Chad it was even more limited to almost non-existent. French rule was really only felt in Fort Lamy, which in 1912 became the administrative capital of the colony, and the much more populated south. The northern desert was largely ignored by the French and left to govern itself. France primarily used the colony as a cotton producer, a source of men to be recruited to fight in France's wars, or a source of cheap labor that could be sent to other African colonies. Chad in World War II would notably be the first French colony to officially align itself with the Free French. Post-war, Chad would see many French colonies begin to agitate for freedom and greater self-autonomy. Chad would see itself divided between two main political groups. There was the PPT, which represented African nationalists and was more popular in the south, the region more focused on by the French. And then there was the UDT, which would later be replaced by the AST, which represented the pro-status quo faction in Chad and was more supported by Muslims in the north. The people who, under the current system, remember, were largely left alone from the colonial administration. This can give us a pretty big hint as to how people in the South felt about French rule and their civilizing mission, since they were the people who were more willing to support decolonization, while the North supporting the UDT and AST shows that they likely felt more happy with keeping the status quo and their autonomous status. While initially the PPT was quite weak due to opposition from the colonial elites, it began to grow quite large in the 50s due to more people in the country being given the right to vote. By 1960, the PPT was in charge under its newly appointed leader, Francois Tombobaye, and in the summer of that year, Chad declared independence. Notably, the rivalry between the PPT and the northern parties points to the fact that Chad coming into independence has a very clear distinction between the Muslim North and the Christian South. The history of slave raiding and the different colonial administrative policies that I kind of touched on earlier also helped divide them, and tensions were quite high. Chad immediately began to experience problems. Most of the civil service positions were either held by the few remaining ex-colonial French administrators, new Chadian administrators who were just starting their new jobs and had limited experience, or they were left vacant. Chad's infrastructure was never really even developed by the French, so it was difficult to even move around in the country or transport goods and supplies. And Chad's economy was dominated by solely cotton, so it wasn't very rich. Chadians who wanted to make their voices heard in this new country were quickly snuffed out by Tombobaye, who banned all political parties but his own in 1962. Tombolbaye was a southern Sahra. He, starting in the mid-60s, began attempting to Africanize the country's civil service by removing the remaining French colonial administrators. But Africanization also included removing any Tombolbaye suspected were hostile towards him or just weren't ethnically Sahra. This quickly created problems, as now pretty much all civil servants were inexperienced, and while Africanization may have been popular in some segments of Chadian society, among the non-Sahra peoples, especially those in the north or who were Muslim, they felt less like Chad was being given back to the African people of the country, but rather was now being taken over by the Sahra. In 1966, the National Liberation Front of Chad, or Frontlita, a part Islamic, part Marxist, part non-ideological rebel group, was founded and began waging war against the Chadian government, often operating in neighboring Sudan or Libya. Tombolbaye didn't ease tension with increased Africanization measures in the 70s. Some of these measures weren't that controversial, such as renaming Fort Lamy to its current name, N'Djamena, and encouraging people to get rid of their French first or last name. He himself would take the first name Ngata. However, again, Tombolbaye proved that Africanization in Chad just meant promoting the Sahra ethnic group. He demanded that government workers had to undergo brutal Sahra rituals that included whipping and facial scarring, things that you may be surprised to hear most people aren't super excited about. Tension with Libya, drought, and purges in the army also helped destroy Tombolbaye's image. In 1975, the army mutinied, and Tombolbaye was killed in a gunfight outside the presidential palace. But Tombolbaye's death didn't mean Chad was free from strife. The military came into power and attempted to unify the country, but most rebel groups continued their insurgency, since the military was dominated by Southerners. Libya became more and more involved in the conflict, hoping to both take the northern part of the country, known as the Al-Zawr Strip, a region rich in uranium and manganese, and also establish a friendly state that could help Libya's Muammar Gaddafi expand his influence into sub-Saharan Africa. It occupied the Strip in 1973 and increasingly sent more and more funds to Frontlita. While Tombolbaye had the support of the French, who wanted to protect their economic interest in the region, the military government fell out of favor with them due to tension over French archaeologists being kidnapped by rebel groups. So, French forces left the country and the military government was on its own. By 1979, the government had completely broken down. In late 1979, Frontlita, through negotiations with other factions in Chad and African countries, came to power. Its leader, Gokoni Ouidi, became president, attempted to resolve differences between North and South, and the country moved to a pro-Libya direction and away from the West. Ouidi's government would prove very short-lived, as just 6 months after he came into office, infighting immediately broke out between rival factions in the government. While Ouidi was able to hold on for several years, by 1982 he was forced into exile and a new government under Hissène Habré was put into office. In order to understand Habré, we should go back a little bit. Habré was a northerner, and he joined with Frontlita in its rebellion against Tombolbaye. He also was the one that kidnapped that French archaeologist I mentioned a bit ago. However, he broke with Frontlita after Libya took the Al-Zawr Strip and began taking a very hostile anti-Libya position. He briefly joined with the military government in 1978, but after only a couple months he fought the government in the capital, ultimately proving to be the death knell for the military government. He briefly joined in Ouidi's government, but fighting broke out quickly between the two, and he was back to being a rebel. In 1982, his forces took the capital, and he was put in charge, although the northern half of the country was still opposed to him and occupied by a combination of Libyan and Frontlita troops. Habré's government, while initially quite weak, did manage to find its footing thanks to the assistance of both France and America. Both wanted to secure their economic and geopolitical interest in the region. The CIA sent massive arms and cash shipments via Egypt and Sudan, while the French sent troops on the ground to prevent Libyan or rebel advances into the capital. Israel and Zaire helped train Chadian troops, and Iraq provided money to Habré as well. By 1986, Habré decided to go on the offensive. While Wadi and Frontlita had initially served as an ally to Libyan forces in the north, this had broken down, and Libyan forces were left without their allies. Habré's forces, however, had the backing of the French Air Force, which bombed Libyan positions, and were also supplied by several hundred Toyota Land Cruisers. While Toyotas aren't necessarily known for being unstoppable death machines, they were cheap, reliable, and were able to effectively dodge slow Libyan tanks. By 1987, Libya had given up its control over most of Chad, surrendered the Al-Zawr Strip in 1994, and this last phase of the conflict between Chad and Libya became known as the Toyota War, which I'm sure was great marketing for Toyota. With Habré now firmly in control of the country, He took the country in a somewhat similar direction Tombouctou took it. He banned all rival political groups, he promoted his ethnic group, the Tubu, to high-ranking ministerial positions, and he presented himself as an African nationalist. However, Habré was unique in his brutality. The current Chadian government argues that 40,000 were killed and 200,000 were tortured under Habré's rule. According to the BBC, the most common forms of torture were, quote, electric shocks, near asphyxiation, cigarette burns, and having gas squirted into the eyes, unquote. Oftentimes, victims of Habré's government would be members of rival ethnic groups, such as his mass killings of people associated with the military government in 1984, which were predominantly Sahara people. These killings would be known as Black September. Habré's fall would come in 1990. With many authoritarian governments falling throughout the world, it wasn't a surprise when new forces began pushing for change in Chad. Members of the Sakawa people, the latest ethnic group to be systematically targeted by Habré's government, led the newest charge against the government, forming the Patriotic Salvation Movement, or MPS. The MPS quickly pushed towards the capital with the backing of both Libya and Sudan. While France was expected to destroy this new upstart rebel group, it instead declined to intervene. This is seen as a combination of France both rejecting the brutal rule of Habré, but also wanting Habré gone so there would be less American influence in the country, which may make it easier for French businesses to dominate. On December 2nd, N'Djamena would fall and the MPS would take charge. The MPS was led by a former ally of Habré, Idriss Deby. Deby, a member of the Sakawa ethnic group, led Habré's forces on several occasions, including in Black September, a small border conflict with Nigeria in the early 80s, and in the Toyota War. After Habré began persecuting his ethnic group, Deby flipped his support and immediately began working with anti-Habré forces. When he took the capital, he proclaimed that, quote, "I have brought you neither gold nor silver, but liberty." So how true would this be? Well, let's first talk about the gold and silver. Chad for a couple of decades had thought about extracting oil found in the country, but due to internal instability, it never really had the ability to do so. Deby managed to bring stability, at least initially, and petroleum production was able to begin in the country, with the help of large oil companies like ExxonMobil. This greatly grew Chad's economy, and Deby announced that this new oil money would go towards improving healthcare, education, and infrastructure in the country. Some oil money did end up going to these sectors, but the majority of this money ended up going to Deby himself. Deby's government was very corrupt, with him spending lavishly on himself and his family. He also often appointed either members of his family or members of his ethnic group to top government or military positions. A lot of this new oil money would also go towards the army, which was needed as rebellions began breaking out in the mid-2000s. Deby promised to turn Chad into a democracy and did allow some opposition parties to freely operate in the country, and he held elections for the first time in the country's history. However, Chad's elections were considered by most to be neither free nor fair, with the MPS sweeping almost every election. While Deby did allow some opposition to exist, most opposition parties are only allowed to criticize Deby to a point. In 2005, after an election that many believed was rigged, rebel groups began attempting to overthrow Deby. In both 2006 and 2008, rebel groups would siege the capital and actually came close to taking the capital, but the well-supplied Chadian army, disunity among the rebels, and Deby receiving assistance from various countries all saved him from being overthrown, and the rebels so far have only been able to really operate in the border areas of the country. One of Chad's greatest exports in Africa is fighting men. As I talked about in the Central African Republic episode, rebels in the country are often accused of being Chadians, and there is probably some Chadian fighters among the ex-Seleka factions. Chad also provides, or at least did provide, one of the largest peacekeeping groups in the country. In Sudan, Chad has been accused of aiding rebel groups, especially those mostly made up of Zagawa fighters, while Chadian rebel groups have also been involved in aiding the Sudanese government in Darfur. In Libya, since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, rebel Chadian groups have aided various different factions, hoping to influence whoever wins the civil war into opposing Deby. The Chadian army has, since 2014, been involved in fighting Boko Haram, after the Islamist group took several towns on Chad's border with Cameroon, Nigeria, and Niger. It also has sent troops during the Second Congo War and the war in northern Mali. Interestingly, depending on how you look at Chad's foreign policy, either Deby is a force for stability or a force for chaos in North and Central Africa. One YouTube channel, African Biographics, in their video on Idriss Deby praises him for fighting against Boko Haram, saying it was good that Chad helped fight terrorist groups. However, a book I found by Issei Toga, a Chadian opposition figure, Idriss Deby and the War in Darfur, blames Chad for creating unrest in the Darfur region of Sudan and the Central African Republic. It also blames him for being corrupt, being authoritarian, favoring northern Muslims, and allegedly not even being born in Chad. What this shows is that Deby's legacy is still very much disputed, and time will tell if Deby moved Chad and Africa into a positive or negative direction. In 2021, Chad held presidential elections that, surprise surprise, Deby won in a landslide. However, rebel groups from Libya began pushing south, trying to disrupt elections and overthrow Deby. Deby was unique in the fact that he, a head of state, led from the front. On April 20th, 2021, Deby was killed fighting rebels in northern Chad. Honestly, it still is crazy to think about an active serving head of state dying in combat. Honestly, something I couldn't imagine for most world leaders, which all in all is probably a good thing. While Deby was killed, the rebel forces were halted from taking the capital and forced north. Deby's death resulted in his son, Mahatma Deby, coming into power and a transitional government being set up. Right now, this transitional government is still active. Apparently they are, or maybe were, trying to negotiate with rebel groups, but unless serious changes are made, I'm not sure most rebel groups will actually agree to lay down their arms. Regardless, Chad right now is in a pretty tough state. Chad is one of the poorest countries in the world. It is the second lowest country in the world for life expectancy, at only 55, has a weak education sector, a weak healthcare sector, and poor infrastructure. It also has in recent years suffered greatly from environmental degradation. Lake Chad has over the past couple decades been shrinking. It went from one of the largest lakes in the world, the size of Burundi, to losing the majority of its water by the 80s due to population growth around the lake and droughts. While there has been some limited growth since the 90s, it still has seen a massive decrease, and it has been putting a lot of strain on the region's population and wildlife. While Chad isn't as hard hit as, say, Nigeria, it still will likely be a brutal transition to go through, and one which won't be helped by a poor and corrupt government. So why does Chad exist? Chad is very similar to the Central African Republic. It was colonized and created by the French, and its history is often characterized by division between the North and the South. Both countries really are the product of French colonialism. It is unique, though, in being almost continuously in internal unrest throughout its entire history being independent. While the transitional government will likely try to stop this from continuing, it's sadly doubtful Chad will be able to improve unless serious change occurs. Up next, we will go to Chile. Prepare for a very long country, the Spanish, wars with Bolivia and Peru, 9/11, and unrest. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed Chad. It was very similar to the last episode, the Central African Republic. I mean, not exactly the same and everything, but a lot of the themes that were present in the Central African Republic came up in the history of Chad, and I mentioned that a lot throughout the episode. The history episodes will move away from Africa. I think the last three have all been in Africa, and now we'll move away from Africa for a little bit. Next, I am going to do a special, big project. It's essentially going to be a history of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, but looking at it through the lens of several YouTubers that joined the party in 2019 and asking if they hurt or helped the party. And then after that, I will do the history of Chile, and then I will do Ukrainian political parties. So yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used for today's episode are Afric Network's video on the Wadi Sultanate, African Biographics video on Idriss Deby, Hissène Habré, and Francis Doumbouya, BBC's profile on Hissène Habré, Feature History's video on the Great Toyota War, Geography Now's video on Chad, Google Earth's video, Lake Chad UNEP, and Google Earth highlight environmental changes, Historyville's video, How Chad Was Colonized, Human Rights Watch page, Habre's government committed systematic atrocities, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Chad, Nathan Powell's video, History of Chad, North O2's video, The Perplexing Prehistory of the Sahara, Sankofa Pan-African Series video on the Kanem-Bornu Empire, South Africa History Online's page on Chad, the book Idriss Deby and the Darfur Conflict, World History EDU's page on the Trans-Saharan slave trade, and finally Wikipedia.